Only one day. Okay. So we left off last week with a discussion about some of the roots of what was going on with both German anti-Semitism and with Hitler's anti-Semitism prior to the Weimar Republic. And, the fact is one might have looked at that and said, oh, you know what, both Germany was moving away from anti-Semitism, or at least sort of its more public manifestations of it. Hitler was, again, sort of a dissolute and somewhat, aimless young man without any particular obsession about the Jews. And then World War I comes to an end. And, the collapse of Germany was a tremendous trauma to the German people, the German psyche, whatever, sort of terminology one wants to use. And, it is worth understanding that, look, we live in an age where we have access to so much information, and yet many people still, only look at the news that corresponds to the way they would like the world to work. Imagine you're a German in 1918. The year begins with Russia leaving the war. Right, the Russians surrender. They sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Much of the year is taken up with the German army launching renewed offensives in France. All the news they're getting at home, things are bad at home. There's hunger. There's strikes, there's all kinds of problems at home. And the hunger, let's keep that in mind because this can be important later on. But everything you're seeing is pointing to a German victory, right? The one sort of dark spot on the horizon are the Americans arriving in France. But, you have reason to conclude that things will work out all right. And, suddenly, seemingly, everything falls apart. End of October, beginning of November 1918, the Ottomans collapse, the Austria-Hungarians collapse, and Germany collapses as well, right? You go to bed one night, and there's trouble, right? Things are becoming complex. You wake up the next day, the Kaiser has fled, the monarchy is over, right? Everything has changed, and an armistice is signed, or called for, I should say. And this idea of the Dolchstoßlegende, right, the stab in the back theory, comes to dominate a lot of German thought, right? The idea that some sinister force or forces stab Germany in the back, right? The soldiers at the front, of course, right, were doing all the things that they should have done. The only way this could have happened was, and that somebody, it could be communists, it could be socialists, it could be Jews, it could be profiteers, and any number of things coming in there. But certainly, in a lot of these, Jews start to figure very heavily in the mythology that's developing. Jews certainly are fairly prominent in some of the manifestations of revolutionary activity in late 1918, early 1919. Rosa Luxemburg, who, it's somewhat ironic, actually opposed the German Revolution in early 1919, thought that it was not time, but certainly was involved with it, right? Sort of went along with it, even though it was against her best wishes. Kurt Eisner, who establishes a sort of socialist Republic of Bavaria, Toller and Levine, who, after Eisner is assassinated, set up even more Bolshevik republic in Bavaria. So, there's a lot of revolutionary activity taking place in Germany at the end of 1918 into 1919. By no means are Jews a majority of the revolutionaries, and not even necessarily the leaders of all these, right? Luxemburg was Jewish, but Karl Liebknecht, who actually led the Spartacist uprising, was not. But again, in the minds of anti-Semites, it's not hard to draw the conclusion that the Jews are behind this. And, there's this kind of weird thing that happens where, the revolutions break out in response to the collapse of Germany, right? I mean, Germany was falling apart and then the revolutions break out. In the minds of a lot of people, though, this sort of gets flipped, right? Why does Germany fall apart? Because of the revolutionaries. The revolutionaries had not led people astray, right? Things would have held up.
Nazi Germany.
David, can I interrupt you? Would everyone please mute your sound? Please mute your sound. It's in the bottom left corner of your screen.
David, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
Wasn't the Spanish flu out in 1918?
Yeah.
Did that affect things?
Yeah, well, look, yeah, so it's a good question. I don't know enough about the specifics of what was going on in Germany. Certainly, the Spanish flu is going to hit all of them, right? Germany was suffering major food shortages before that happened. So, it would have certainly been ripe for, the impacts. There's a whole lot of things taking place. But, again, I want to stress it. There's all kinds of good reasons that somebody could look at and say why Germany collapses if you know what happened. So many Germans in 1918 were living in this kind of bubble. Not all of them, without question. There were those who thought the war was dismal and wanted to end it and so forth. But for a lot of Germans who just were opening up their paper every day and seeing German victory after German victory until the day they opened up the paper and saw, right, German defeat, there was very little sort of rational way to put all this together other than to create this kind of conspiracy theory, right? I mean, something we see all too well there. The revolutionaries on the right are put down, the revolutionaries on the left are put down, the Weimar Republic is established, and there again, right, a Weimar Germany which has certainly not Jews in a dominant political role, but a number of Jews in a prominent enough role. Hugo Preuss is a Jewish attorney who drafts the Weimar Constitution. Walter Rathenau, who is foreign minister before he's assassinated. Cultural figures, right? So Jews are playing certainly a very prominent role. And as we know, the way anti-Semitism works, it's not difficult to say, go from prominence to controlling, right? If you see all these Jews doing all this stuff, to say it's Jews who are leading our country astray economically, politically, and culturally, right? We're becoming a mongrel society. Which brings us to the Nazis. And it's worth pointing out Hitler was not one of the founders of the Nazi Party. And it's interesting to look, when World War I ends, for those who don't know, most German soldiers demobilize, right? The German army very quickly reduces in size as soldiers go home. A lot of soldiers end up fighting in various sort of street militias. Hitler has no home to go to, right? And one of the things that's interesting about sort of the accounts of Hitler during the war, there's an interesting book that came out a few years ago, Hitler's First War, I think, about actual Hitler's World War I experience, is, Hitler's parents were dead. He was an Austrian anyway. When he had gone home on visits, gone to Germany on visits, he has no family there. He's horrified by the defeatism he sees. When the war ends, while all these other soldiers want to just go back home and take off their uniforms, Hitler actually wants to stay in the army, right? Because he has no better alternative. The army is actually the first time in his life that he has like a full-time regular job and 3 meals a day and all this other stuff, right? I mean, he'd been basically homeless, on the streets of Munich before World War I broke out. So he stays in the army as sort of a political agent. His job is to go around in Bavaria to these different beer halls and spy on meetings of all these little political parties that are forming, right? That's his job, and it's running out very soon. He's going to be, out of that as well. And then in early 1920, he visits the meeting of this, National Socialist German worker. At that point, it's just the German Workers' Party. It will then be renamed the Nationalsozialistische Deutsches Arbeiterpartei National. That's where Nazi comes from. His party membership number is actually, it's a funny thing. He's listed as party member number 555. He's actually number 55, but they wanted to make the party look bigger, so they began the membership roster at 500. And he had gone just to watch the party, and then he makes a speech and captivates the audience. And this is sort of this dramatic moment where Hitler finds sort of his calling. as a speaker, as a leader, right? You know, as far as this stuff goes. So you understand, he does not craft the anti-Semitism of the Nazi Party, doesn't craft the party itself. There were no shortage of political parties that basically the same basic worldview. Betrayed at Versailles, November criminals, right, the Jews, et cetera, et cetera. What the Nazi Party had was Hitler. And it's interesting, right, sort of think about prior to Hitler, you know, lots of people were saying the same sort of thing that Hitler was saying, but German political speakers tended to provide these kind of pedantic professorial speeches, right? They gave up there and they delivered these, you know, essentially academic lectures. And you can imagine like just sort of a German caricature getting up there and giving these sort of very serious speeches about what has to be done and so forth. And Hitler delivers these electrifying talks that capture the emotions of the people, right? That's really what propels the Nazi Party, not their ideas, but the person of Hitler himself. And it's interesting to look at their ideas. And so, again, this is, in 1925, they put out a 25-point party platform. And it's an interesting sort of dichotomy. You begin with the basic, you know, we need our land restored, we need to have land for our people, all this stuff. Then very soon after the first three passages or points which deal with Germany's borders and its foreign relations, we get into the issue of race. Only a member of the race can be a citizen. A member of the race can only be one who is of German blood without consideration of creed. Consequently, no Jew can be a member of the race. Whoever has no citizenship is to be able to live in Germany only as a guest and must be under the authority of legislation for foreigners. The right to determine matters concerning administration and law belongs only to the citizen, right? So all public offices should only be held by citizens. We demand that the state be charged first in providing the opportunity for a livelihood and way of life for the citizens, right? I mean that, you know, resident aliens may be second in line when it comes to employment and occupational opportunities. Further immigration of non-citizens to be prevented. You know, so we have here a series of fairly blatantly anti-Semitic policies, which I'll get to in a minute. When you look at some of the other policies, though, it's interesting because a lot of them are things that we would say, oh, sounds pretty good, right? Abolition of unearned work and labor incomes, breaking of rent slavery, total confiscation of war profits, the nationalization of previous associated industries, a division of profits of all heavy industries, an expansion of old age welfare, state is to care for the elevating national health by providing the mother and child, by outlawing child labor, by the encouragement of physical fitness, by means of legal establishment of gymnastic and sport obligation, improvements in national education, right, so that gifted, right, children should have all the same opportunities as rich children, land reform, right, a whole array of things which are, you know, basically no different from things any progressive socialist would say today, right? The big difference being that how they qualify citizenship. But even when we look at the exclusionary aspects of this, right, it's very much in keeping with 19th century anti-Semitism, right? That the big plan, let's say, out and
there he is.
We all
I don't
did.
know,
We all
David.
did. I did as well.
Okay, all right. So let's go back to this. All right. So if you look at the Nazi Party platform from 1925, there's surely nothing in it that speaks of extermination. That the policies sort of the policies sort of suggested are ones which were keeping with, let's say, the ideas of anti-Semites from the 1870s, right? Rolling back emancipation, right? The Jews would not have equality. The Jews could no longer have positions in the government, which they'd only had for a few years anyway. You know, they couldn't vote, which was going back even further. But essentially, sort of restoring this idea of Jews as second-class subjects of society. Certainly not good if you're a Jew, but a far cry from where things end up. And it's worth, again, keeping in mind with the progressive stuff here, which is that the Nazi Party was founded by radicals. It's not like, oh, that means Nazism is socialism, but a lot of these ideas, the ideas of National Socialism and other forms of socialism were in circulation. There was a radical wing of the Nazi Party, which, again, just as anti-Semitic as the non-radical wing, but it is interesting. All right, look, as for Hitler himself, intentionalists try and make a lot of a few statements he makes in Mein Kampf, right? Here's the big one. Right? So big, in fact, that this is what Lucy Davidovitz opens her book, intentionalist book, The War on the Jews, with. At the beginning of the war, even during the war, this is referring to World War I, if 12 or 15,000 of these Jews who are corrupting the nation have been forced to submit to poison gas, just as hundreds of thousands of our best German workers from every social stratum and from every trade and calling had to face it in the field, then the millions of sacrifices made at the front would not have been in vain. If 10 or 12,000 public traitors, profiteers, usurers, and swindlers had been gassed, right, the nation could have been saved. And so, for obvious reasons, this is trotted out as a sort of evidence that Hitler was planning sort of the extermination of the Jews already in the 1920s. I'd say it's a pretty small hook to hang things on, right? Hitler himself had gone through a gas at the front. It's pretty clear he's talking here not about some sort of mass gassing of an entire people, but just sort of rhetorically making an argument that, hey, look, if instead of a bunch of good Germans like me getting gassed, right, they gassed a small number of these Jewish profiteers. And it's kind of interesting because he uses the number 12 or 15,000. As a matter of fact, about 12,000 Jews were killed at the front, not by gas, but various means. And between this and let's say 1939, you don't really have a lot from Hitler suggesting a final solution as it comes to be known. So those who wish to try and make this intentionalist argument really have only a few scraps to go on. When you get to the actual Nazi policy and power, again, not a lot of evidence to argue that there was some sort of scheme for extermination. In fact, I'd say considerable evidence to the contrary. So when the Third Reich takes over, you do have in March this 1933, this spate of anti-Jewish violence, fairly localized. It's not centralized. It's not later on like Kristallnacht, where you have orders coming from above. It seems that when the Nazis do well in the March elections, March 33, all over the country, right, Nazis and fellow travelers take it in their hands to go and beat Jews and break Jewish windows and so forth. But in April 1933, the Nazis, again, not officially, not as a government policy, but call for a national boycott of Jewish businesses, not terribly successful. Right. And it's, again, interesting when you look at this, that in fact, you actually had some Nazis petitioning the German government to end the boycott, because these were Nazis who worked for Jewish business concerns and saying, hey, listen, if Ulstein Company isn't publishing, a bunch of Aryans aren't getting paid. At this point, even the Nazis themselves, even in higher government officials, were far more willing to turn a blind eye to Jewish business and so forth because, economic considerations. And the rest of the 1930s, though, sees the German government taking steps to make sure that the Jews become further marginalized. April 33 sees the first anti-Semitic law passed in Germany since the formation of the German Empire. Right, as I mentioned last week, there was some de jure anti-Semitic policy, but there were no anti-Semitic laws in Wilhelmine, Germany. April 1933, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service is passed, which bans Jews and other political desirables from the civil service, which again rolls things back a bit. And even there, though, it's interesting. Paul von Hindenburg, the war hero who was president of the Reich at the time, sends a letter to Hitler saying, look, basically, I've heard that you're planning to kick the Jews out of the civil service. Hold up on that. I don't object to kicking regular Jews out of the civil service, but as Hindenburg says, as far as my own feelings are concerned, officials, judges, teachers, and lawyers who are war invalids, fought at the front, are sons of war dead, or themselves lost sons in the war should remain in their positions unless an individual case give reasons for different treatment. If they are worthy of fighting for Germany and bleeding for Germany, then they must also be considered worthy of continuing to serve the fatherland. Hitler is not interested in, standing up to von Hindenburg on this issue. He says, fine. Though it's interesting in the letter that Hitler sends to von Hindenburg, he has this kind of message as well. Look, you mentioned the Jews who served at the front because they were compelled to by a draft, like not giving any credit to Jews being, good Germans, but I'll concede the point. And in fact, the Jews in the civil service, there weren't a lot, and these exemptions, at least for now, did protect most of them. About 70% of Jewish civil servants were able to hold on to their jobs because of these different exemptions. Close to 50% of Jewish judges were able to hold on to their jobs because of these exemptions. So it's a step, but one which, again, still a far cry from where we're going to end up. But over the course of the remaining decade, lots and lots of anti-Jewish laws are passed on all levels, right? Restricting Jews from schools, restricting Jews from various occupations, right? All this stuff. But what is the point of all these laws, right? And that's really what this is about. The sort of intentionalist narrative of all this is that this is all building up to the point where the Jews are so isolated from German society, right? So marginalized that nobody's going to blink or object when the extermination begins, right? The problem with that is that during the 1930s, right, there seems to be another very obvious goal in mind for these policies. What's the other goal in mind? The more immediate goal?
Emigration.
Emigration, right? Right, meaning that, the notion that there was this long-term plan to eventually exterminate the Jews is rendered fairly problematic by the fact that the German policies in the 1930s are actually designed pretty clearly to convince German Jews to leave. And this is not really essential, but just to give you some sense of, let's say why a lot of Germans would not have had a problem with things like the law barring Jews from certain professions. Jews were pretty small part of the population. 11% of physicians were Jews, 16% of attorneys, the big publishing companies, Jewish run, half of the private banks, most major department stores, right? Figures in the arts, journalism, livestock dealers in Bavaria, right? So, when this begins, a lot of Germans are like, oh yeah, maybe there should be more opportunities. Maybe Jews have, taken on too much for themselves. But again, still a far cry from extermination. Even when we look at the Nuremberg Laws, right, it's an interesting thing. The Nuremberg Laws basically legally establish the place of Jews in German society, right? Law for the protection of German blood and German honor, the right citizenship law saying, right, defining Jews as, right, subjects of the state, not citizens, stipulating certain restrictions to Jews, right, what Jews can and can't do to some extent. Again, there'll be more pests and so forth. And again, it's interesting for our purposes. We tend, right, to look at the Nuremberg Laws as this kind of, let me go back to that, as this kind of forerunner of the Holocaust, right? Here's a step towards the final solution. There's an argument to be made that at least some German Jews at the time actually viewed the Nuremberg Laws sort of as a stabilizing force, right? Meaning that from 1933 till the end of 1935, Jews live in Germany in this kind of erratic situation where nobody knows what their real status is, right? Jews don't know what the future is going to bring. And there is an argument to be made that the Nuremberg Law actually serves, at the time, is seen by at least some German Jews as a good, now we got it. This is who we are. This is the law we have. This is like the bottom, but we know that we still have a place in German society. It's not a good place, but it's a place, and maybe at some point where we can get past this. And there's some evidence, you look at immigration, to suggest that, right, German Jews are certainly emigrating during the 1930s, but it's not moving all in one direction, right? So 1933, you got 37,000 Jews leave, and that's when things are the most chaotic and there's the most anti-Jewish violence. Calms down a bit in 34, 35, when the Nuremberg Laws are passed, right, goes down, goes up a little bit in 36, declines in 37. And part of that is because in 36, a lot of the public manifestations of anti-Semitism declined. Anybody know the reason why? Yeah, David Silverman?
Yes, the Olympics.
Yeah, right. The Germans make a sort of big push to make Germany more sort of like sort of friendly seeming. A lot of the signs in public places, the anti-Semitic placards and so forth, are taken down. The party members are made sure to be on their best behavior, so there'll be no manifestations of anti-Jewish violence and so forth. So you don't actually have this kind of like, as we imagine, this kind of like consistent buildup of anti-Jewish violence and policy culminating in the final solution. You actually have these sort of dips up and down in this stuff. Which again leaves some Jews thinking, okay, we've reached a sort of plateau here. If you're a German Jew living in Germany in 1936, you might think, okay, great, look, we've been through the worst of it. We've calmed down now, right? Things are going to level out. For 38, things change a bit. And I do want to clarify one point, which is one of my little pet peeves. Contrary to popular misconception, the Nuremberg Laws do not say that if you have one Jewish grandparent, you're a Jew. Rather, it creates this sort of multi-tiered sort of status of Jews and Mischlinge of the first and second degree. So Mischling means mixed or mutt, right, in German. So if you have certainly two or more, if you have three or more Jewish grandparents, you are a Jew, right? So, right, three Jewish grandparents, you're a Jew, no question there. Well, some question, we'll see in a minute. If you have one or two Jewish grandparents, though, you are a Mischlinge first or second category. And then there's a wide variety of other things that might define you as a Jew or might define you as a Mischling, right? Right. You might have two Jewish grandparents, but are a member of the Jewish community, right? And identify as a Jew. That would probably make you a Jew, right? Whereas if you have a Jewish grandparent or two Jewish grandparents even, but you're Aryan in other respects, right, you might be considered to be either a Mischling or Aryanized. And the status of the Mischlinge is, again, a complex one. Anybody know why the Germans certainly view the Mischlinge as racially problematic, right? Here are people who are likely to pollute the race. The reason why they don't act further, though, is precisely what I was mentioning before. Right? The German government wants to isolate the Jews. You can isolate the Jews, right, because they're not related to non-Jews. The problem with the Mischlinge is that there are a lot of them, and a lot of them are part of well-off, prominent, influential families in Germany, right? Non-Jewish families, right? So military families, industrialist families. Even the guy who assassinated Walter Rathenau was a Mischling. So the Nazi view of the Mischlinge is this sort of complex thing where there's talk, very hush-hush, that when all this is over, when the war is over, they can be sterilized, right, to remove their taint from the gene pool. They shouldn't be allowed to serve in the military. but there's a lot of exceptions. There are a lot of people who are able to be, quote, Aryanized, right? Hitler actually takes a very personal role in this. Even in very critical points in the war, Hitler is reviewing people's petitions to be Aryanized, and allowing people to, right, if they don't have a Jewish nose, if they've got a good military record and so forth. And it creates these weird sort of situations where, where, for example, anybody here know the Wittgenstein family? Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher?
Yes.
Yeah, so the Wittgensteins before World War I were one of the wealthiest families in Austria-Hungary, right? Top industrialists, sort of like the Wittgenstein patriarchs, like their version of, you know, Andrew Carnegie or Henry Frick or whatever it may be, right? Right, prominent industrialists. But here's the funny thing: the Wittgenstein family had 3 Jewish grandparents, right, all of whom had converted to Christianity, and 1 non-Jewish grandparent. The non-Jewish grandparent being the maternal grandmother, right? So Ludwig Wittgenstein, halakhically, actually wasn't Jewish. He and his siblings were not halakhically Jewish. They are, however, because of the 3 Jewish grandparents, and again, they were raised as Christians. Their parents were raised in Christian families because the grandparents had converted or been born Christian. So the Wittgensteins, when the Germans take over Austria, are declared Jews by virtue of the fact that they have 3 biologically Jewish grandparents. They're able to get themselves Aryanized because of their connections and because they converted several generations ago and so forth. But it's this crazy situation where people are not halakhically Jewish or nonetheless can be tapped as Jews. People who are halakhically Jewish are able to avoid this because, you know, as far as the Nazis are concerned, your Jewish maternal grandmother is outweighed perhaps by your 3 good German grandparents and their money and you know, military influence and so forth. So many Jews do emigrate. They tend to end up in other German-speaking countries at the time. Now, one problem with Jewish immigration, which again is often used as an example of showing like how the Germans are trying to keep the Jews from emigrating, is the rules on what you can take out with you. This actually wasn't originally a Nazi policy, right? Back in like 1929 or so, maybe 1930, the Weimar German government was afraid of people taking money and property out of Germany, and so they had passed laws limiting how much wealth you could leave. The Nazis do add further restrictions to that, right, just to make it difficult for Jews. And obviously, from a Jewish perspective, the Germans had said to the Jews, you can leave with whatever you want to, a lot more Jews would have left. You know, for just as obvious reasons, the Germans weren't interested in doing that. But it is worth pointing out that some of the barriers that were placed on emigration weren't necessarily placed on Jewish immigration. They were placed on anybody emigrating with too much of their wealth. Although, again, there were more restrictions than the Nazis. This creates, though, a complicated situation. The Germans want the Jews to leave, right? Certainly the Nazi government wants the Jews to leave. A lot of Jews want to leave. They just can't leave or won't leave because they have to leave so much of their resources behind. This leads to one of the but the most successful emigration scheme of the Third Reich. Anybody know what I'm talking about? The most successful Jewish emigration scheme of the Third Reich is something called the Havarrah Agreement. Right? This was a secret agreement that was made between the Nazis and the Jewish agency in Palestine. Right? It's a complex situation here, where basically you have the Yishuv in Palestine. They want Jews. The problem is, what restrictions were there on Jews coming to Palestine in, let's say, 1936?
The British mandate.
British, but what was the British qualification? What did you have to be able to show before you go to Palestine?
I guess wealth.
Wealth, yeah, you're right. Going back to 1922, the Churchill White Paper, efforts made to limit immigration based on the economic capacity of the mandate. So Jews had to demonstrate a certain amount of wealth and property or job before they could come to Palestine, right? So you have the Yishuv, which wants to bring in Jews, right? They're limited because most Jews who had money weren't leaving, weren't going to go to Palestine. You have Jews in Germany who would love to go anywhere other than Germany, especially if they could bring their wealth with them. You have a Nazi government that wants to get rid of Jews and also wants foreign hard currency. And so this complicated sort of triangle is worked out where, basically the Jews of Germany are able to purchase through this sort of holding company in Palestine, German agricultural equipment, right? Tractors and, things like that. And then they can show to the British, hey, I'm coming to Palestine with valuable equipment, which the Yishuv needs. And they're allowed to bring it. That allows Jews to leave Germany, which is what the German government wants. It allows foreign money because, again, part of that money has to do with it being brought in by the Yishuv. They're contributing part of this stuff as well to bring in foreign currency. So Germany gets rid of Jews and gets foreign currency. The Yishuv gets Jews and agricultural equipment. And about 60,000 Jews are able to benefit from this, which, of course, raises, from an intentionalist viewpoint, the obvious problem, right? If the Nazi plan is to exterminate the Jews, right, why are they working with the Yishuv to provide Jews with emigration certificates, right? And it's interesting, even just looking at sort of other, sort of manifestations of Nazi ideas in the time, right? The idea of the Jews leaving, and particularly the Jews going to Palestine, was certainly in people's consciousness. Here's a game. It was not an official Nazi game, but it was a board game made in Germany in 1936 called Judenfrei. Okay, and the goal here is to go aus nach Palästina, right, for the Jews to get out of Germany and make their way to Palestine. Right, this was again a German board game, not a Jewish board game. You have here an interesting cartoon from the late 1930s. Right, shows the stormtrooper pointing the Jews to run, but it's an interesting thing because if you look, right, the Jews are fleeing, and there's this very negative sort of set of caricatures, but there seems to be some sort of intimation that they're not just running to disaster, right? They seem to be running to some kind of Jewish castle, which I have to assume, again, is some suggestion that there's something actually positive, right? There's the pot of gold there at the end of the rainbow, right? That during this period, German policies basically get the Jews gone wherever they can go, right? And even you look at the Evian Conference, which is called in July 1938 after the Anschluss of Austria, where there's this new spate of Jewish immigration, right? The German government isn't standing in the way of German immigration, of Jewish immigration, right? The Evian Conference is, as far as the Germans are concerned, great. You want to take in Jews, and in fact, the very fact that so few countries are willing to take in Jews is used by the Germans as propaganda to say, hey, listen, don't blame us. We want to get rid of you people, right? Don't blame us if nobody else will take the Jews, right? Don't blame us for wanting to get rid of them. And again, the German cartoons at the time and statements from Hitler are very much this idea that, hey, listen, all the nations of the world criticize us for our treatment of the Jews, right? But you won't take them yourselves. Right, but it's pretty clear at this juncture that if the British Empire had said we will drop 100,000 Jews in some colony in Africa, right? For the most part, we'll see that's about to change. The Germans wouldn't have said no. We've got better plans for them. They would have said take them. which brings us to the beginning of 1939, which again, Hitler makes a speech which is often used by intentionalists as evidence of the master plan. So January 30th is the anniversary of Hitler's accession to the chancellorship, right? Every year there'd be a big speech in the Reichstag. Today will once more be a prophet. If the international Jewish financiers in and outside Europe should succeed in plunging nations once more into a world war, then the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe, which in German is Sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa. And again, obviously, we can say that those things can mean different things in different contexts, but certainly from an intentionalist perspective, here you seem to have Hitler before the war saying, look, if we go to war, this will mean the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. The problem with that sort of understanding is it's, again, just sort of taking this one snippet of a Hitler speech, which is something like a 2-hour-long speech, because it's Hitler, and sort of putting it front and center. This was not a major part of his speech. And not only is it not a major part of his speech, but it took place in a context of a discussion of emigration, right? That after Kristallnacht, there was a new diplomatic initiative, both inside and outside Germany, to figure out something to do with the Jews. And there were negotiations taking place at the very end of 1938 about a resolution to the refugee problem. Oswald Pirro, sort of a right-wing South African politician, goes to meet with Hitler, sort of with the blessing of Neville Chamberlain, and there's a discussion that takes place, right? What can we do with these Jews, right? Well, the Germans are looking for money at this point. There are some feelers put up by the Germans to say, well, listen, maybe in exchange for a large loan or payment from the English and French or the Jews themselves, the Jews of Germany at this point are pretty much destitute, something could be arranged, right? And again, from the German perspective, the arrangement is easy, right? We'll let them go, just set something up. This is the context of Hitler's speech, right? So Hitler's speech is actually, right, what he says about annihilation takes place after this, right? In connection with the Jewish question, I have this to say. It is a shameful spectacle to see how the whole democratic world is oozing sympathy for the poor, tormented Jewish people, but remains hard-hearted and obdurate when it comes to helping them, which is surely in view of its attitude and obvious duty. The arguments that are brought up as an excuse for not helping them actually speak for us Germans and Italians. For this is what they say. We, that is the democracies, are not in a position to take in the Jews. Yet in these empires, there are not 10 people in the square kilometer, while Germany, with 135 inhabitants to square kilometer, is supposed to have room for them. They assure us we cannot take them unless Germany is prepared to allow them a certain amount of capital to bring them with them as immigrants. For hundreds of years, Germany was good enough to receive these elements, although they possess nothing except infectious political and physical diseases. What they possess today, they have by a very large extent gained at the cost of less astute germination or the most reprehensible manipulations. So that statement about the annihilation of the Jews is actually coming at the tail end of this larger discussion centered on emigration, right? Like, look, we're ready to let the Jews emigrate. We're ready, if the people want to take them, to take them. They say we got to let them out with money. Well, you know what? We're not going to let them out with money because that's German money. But if they want them, right, they can have them. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. And certainly I would say that here in January 1939, the discussion is still very much a discussion about emigration, right? How we'll give them up, right? We want something for them, that's fine, but you want them, they're yours. But it is fair to say that there is this, right, we're moving in the wrong direction, this hint of something else, right? Because the tenor of Hitler's speech and some of the negotiations, because you start to have in these negotiations and in the Havarrah Agreement, one of the reasons why it stops is because some German officials are saying, maybe it's not such a good idea to give the Jews a state. Maybe it's not such a good idea to gather the Jews in some place where they can scheme and plan and so forth. What happens if we can't get rid of the Jews before war breaks out, right? What do we do with them then? So you start to have, by the end of 1938 and beginning of 1939, some discussion is already beginning to take place about a plan B, right? So through the 1930s, it's certainly fair to say, yeah, the general scheme is emigration. By 1939, at least some people in the government are starting at least to, broot the subject of, okay, war might be coming soon. We still have hundreds of thousands of Jews in Germany. What happens if this war breaks out and we still have these people? Which is going to be the discussion of next week as to how German planning goes from emigration to extermination between 1939 and 1941. And I am happy to address any questions or comments or concerns.
So you're leaving us with a cliffhanger?
Yes, and I hope it's not a spoiler, but things don't go well for the Jews.
Don't tell anybody.
Yeah. But yeah, no, listen, if I told you what happened, you wouldn't come back next week.
David, how many people actually did leave on the Havarrah?
About 60,000 Jews leave with the Havarrah, which is more than 10% of the Jewish population of Germany in 1933. So it's not an insignificant number. And certainly for the Yeshuv's perspective, right, by the end of the 1930s, the population of Yeshuv is about 60,000. So about 10% of those are members of the Havarrah Aliyah. So it certainly has a huge impact on the Yeshuv and on Tel Aviv architecture.
Yeah, exactly. Was that how the Bauhaus came from?
Yeah. So you had this right sudden influx of Germans coming again with resources in a way that, and again, these tend to be urban people. Some of them, certainly younger ones, were willing to go and work farms and so forth, but a lot of them were, certainly far happier setting up shop in Tel Aviv than in Degania.
I have a girlfriend who's an archaeologist, and she was born and raised in Israel. She's a Sephardic, and she talks about the fact that she remembers when the Germans came and how they, and her, David Ahuva. She talks about how the Germans, new immigrants, looked down on the Sephardic community like they were nothing, even though they.
In fairness, the German immigrants also looked down on the other Ashkenazi residents as well. So
right, but I mean, yeah.
David,
well, look, I mean, without going through any particular justification. This was, look, Jews were just as racist as anybody else, right?
Yeah, even more so.
The same Jews who were, going through all these, obviously undeserved hardships in the 1930s were certainly celebrants of the German Empire and its treatment of its own African colonies and so forth before 1918, right? I mean, it's always funny when I, because again, teaching high school, and it's like, well, how come nobody complained, in the larger world? Like, what, Americans are going to complain about segregation? Like, these weren't things that people questioned, right? The only question that anybody had is who is the subject of the segregation?
Nothing changed. Nothing's changing. That's sad. Yeah.
David, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jeff.
How easy was it to cross the border and go into Holland or Belgium or the Czech or Czechoslovakia?
So, good question. It's something I actually don't know that much about. I would imagine that on some level it would have been difficult, precisely for the reasons you talked about. I mean, the Germans don't want people sneaking. They certainly don't want Jews sneaking out with, a bag of diamonds, right? So, and I imagine and the flip side is right, it's sort of this perverse thing. The German border authorities don't want Jews sneaking out with resources. The Dutch and Belgian and Czech and Swiss border guards don't want Jews sneaking in without resources.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I would assume that the border security there would have, probably been, fairly good. But
David,
more than that, I would say. Sorry, Barry.
Yeah, I have a few things.
Yeah.
I'm sorry that I missed the first half hour. So you may have
Probably guessed things were bad for the Jews.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Fill you in. Yeah.
so number one, Mishlings of the first and second class.
Yeah.
1942-43, they're shipped off to the concentration.
No. So
Depends who.
this is again exactly why this is so tricky. You couldn't ship these people off because again they're from prominent families. So by the way, I'm going to highly recommend this guy Brian Rigg wrote a book 15, 20 years ago, Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, which is all about Mishling, including people who sometimes were halakhically Jewish in the German military. Goes into this in great detail. I highly recommend it. And he talks about some of the larger policies. Yeah, look, there were Mishling soldiers, even though they weren't supposed to be. There were Mishling soldiers who served throughout the war, right? I mean, they were supposed to be kicked out, but again, some of them were from good families. Some of them had proven themselves, and their commanders were like, "Look, the guy's a good soldier. I'm not going to kick him out." So there was talk of sterilization when the war was over. Like when this is done, and we don't have to worry about, what this does in the home front. Then we could deal with something else. But at that point, no, they weren't sending them to concentration camps, precisely because that would have created tremendous tension. And again, look, some of these people, Hitler needed industrialists. Hitler needed high-ranking military figures. These were precisely the kind of families that often had some Jewish member of the family around, right? Or Mishling a member of the family around.
Okay, question two.
Yeah.
This Havarrah Agreement. What was the Arab response to this?
Well, no, first, nobody was advertising it.
Okay.
Right? So I'll tell you, look, I can tell you the Arab response was the Arab Revolt, right? The thing that set off the Arab Revolt in 1936 was increased Jewish immigration, right? Which in part was set off because of the Havarrah Agreement and increased Jewish migration from Poland. But certainly the sudden influx of Jews into Palestine, precisely at the time where the Great Depression did hit Palestine until 1935. So around the same time that there's a tightening of the job market in Palestine, you have this influx of Jews. So their response was the Arab Revolt. They weren't right. Yeah.
And my third and final is if we could go from the government, from Hitler and the Nazi government, to the man in the street.
Yeah.
I remember many, many years ago, so I may be misremembering, which is very frequent for me. I think the author was Eric Goldhagen.
Jonah Goldhagen.
Jonah.
It was the father and son. So I think Eric is the father, although
Maybe.
Okay.
Well, I don't know. Jonah wrote the one that argued that there was this unique Jewish German anti-Semitism, I assume.
Okay, so that's what I read.
Yeah.
So what about in 1938, 1936, 35, Nuremberg Laws? What is the response of the man in the street? Do they endorse it? According to Jonah,
I would say that the response of the man in the street was, "Thank God I'm not a Jew." Right? I mean, it sounds glib, but I think there's a real power to that answer, right? Meaning that the same guy who has had a Jewish neighbor for the last 20 years who gets on good terms with, but nonetheless is looking around at society. And number one, I do think it's important to note that for a non-Jewish German, for most non-Jewish Germans, the 1930s was a period that saw market improvements in their lives, right? I mean, obviously from a Jewish perspective, Third Reich bad. From a non-Jewish perspective, up to a point, there were a lot of benefits, right? I mean, I'm a German worker in 1936. You know what? I have a radio I didn't have 4 years before. I can take my family on a vacation I couldn't take them on 4 years before. And and thank God I'm not a Jew because things are much worse and for them. And I might think it's unfair, right? We think lots of things in life are unfair, but most people aren't going to risk what they have because of that unfairness, right?
Can I just say that so many academic and professional opportunities became available once Jews were stripped from universities and from public service and couldn't practice as lawyers, couldn't practice as nurse, whatever it was they couldn't do.
Yeah, look, sure.
The job field opened up. It was a paradise.
Yeah, and I want to point out, by the way, in keeping with that, again, our tendency is to view the Third Reich as this oppressive machine, but the Nazis were extremely well attuned to public opinion, right, and to providing for the people something, right. There were Nazi organizations in almost every field, right. So if you think about it in those terms, if I'm a lawyer, right, the people who are supposed to be committed to defending the law, number one, right, is to say, look, getting rid of the Jewish lawyers, who are 11% or whatever is of the lawyers in the country, that opens up a lot of opportunities, right? And you know what? Yeah, maybe I think it's unfair, but hey, partnership just opened up for my firm, not too shabby. And at the same time that's happening, right, this whole hierarchy of the Nazi Law Association develops, and if I want to get ahead, I got to join that. I don't have to be a devout Nazi, but I've got to join these organizations if I wish to benefit. And so, at the same time that things are going bad for Jews, as you point out, Jeff, for a lot of people, in some cases, precisely because things are going bad for the Jews, things are going well. But even if it's not that connected, certainly people make the connection that, hey, 3 years ago, we didn't have these laws. I was unemployed. Things were tough. Nowadays, well, sucks for the Jews, but hey, I got a job and a radio and I'm advancing and all these other things. So, as much as, we can look at what's the bad things happening to the Jews, it's important to keep in mind that for a lot of Germans who knew hardship at this point, they're seeing some non-insignificant improvements. And I don't think the average person is, even if they're inclined to worry about what's going on with the Jews, is inclined enough to, complain too loudly about it.
Do you know the film The Seventh Cross with Spencer Tracy?
No, but I do know that Spencer Tracy's from Wisconsin. Woohoo, go Badgers!
Okay, well, if you can, anyway, you can see, because that's what this is about. How Germans improved their life during this period of time, and so they overlooked the excesses of the government.
Okay. The Seventh Cross. Now, just to add one thing, it's a very complex history, because at the same time that the Jews were being singled out, also anyone who was physically or mentally challenged in a severe way was also being.
Save that for next week.
Oh, that's I'm sorry. No, I don't want to spoil it for you. I'm sorry.
No spoilers. You can say whatever you want.
Okay.
Jeff, that means you read ahead. You read ahead.
Yeah. It's just.
Listen, Jeff, I have one rule in my classes: don't read farther than the teacher.
Sorry. Okay, I will be quiet.
Don't murder those kids. Just like, Mr. Deutsch, I don't know. I'll get back to you. No, yeah, but look, that's the thing, is right. This was an environment where there was not a lot of incentive to express opinions that were different. Right?
This was the one time in the history of the Nazi Party where regular Germans, Aryan Germans, stood up after many years, by 1940, 41, I forget exactly when demonstrated, and that policy of exterminating, and they did, 70, 80,000 people were killed that way, gassed that way. I mean, this may be all exactly what you're going to talk about next week, but there was a halt to that because of public opinion. That was the only time, as far as I know, the Nazis really had to suspend a program because.
Well, but even there, the Nazis. We'll talk about it next week. They are the Nazis. They kept on doing it. Just
Okay.
I don't want to give it credit for too much. When it came to killing people, I think we can agree.
They had a handle. They had a handle on things.
Yeah, but it is interesting. I mean, some of you may be familiar with the Rosenstrasse demonstration of non-Jewish wives of Jewish husbands, right? Which goes back to the whole Michelin thing, right? I mean, these were men who were Jews, but when they were set to be deported, there's a public demonstration. This is during the war of their wives. And this goes back to what I was mentioning before, and we'll pick up with this next week. Hitler, during the war, and the Nazis in general, right, I should say, they're very attuned to, again, as I said, public opinion and the home front, right? Especially once the war begins, and not wanting things that are going to create, as Hitler saw, the same kinds of defeatism on the home front that he'd seen in World War I. Because again, in his view, right, it was the home front where the war was lost the first time around. So a lot of this stuff is the question of, okay, we've got public complaints. How can we quash those? How can we sort of work around that, without upsetting people? Yeah.
Good
Did it? We all good?
We're good. Good night. Thank you so much.
All right. Good night. Night.
Very nice. Thank you, Dave.